In the summer of 1972, a young nurse named Angela vanished without a trace in Rochester, New York. For 3 decades, her sister refused to give up, searching, questioning, hoping. Then, in 2002, she finally found something. But it wasn't closure. What she uncovered didn't just bring answers. It shook the entire town to its core. A discovery so disturbing some people still won't talk about it. This is the story of what really happened to Angela, and what her sister wishes she had never found. Before we begin this investigation, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more mysterious disappearance stories like this one. Rochester, New York in 1972 was a different world. Tree-lined streets where children played until the streetlights came on. Women wore modest dresses. The Vietnam War dominated headlines, but small-town America felt safe and predictable. St. Mary's Hospital sat in the heart of downtown, a beacon of hope where dedicated nurses worked long shifts caring for their community. The summer of 1972 was particularly beautiful. Warm, sunny days, perfect for bicycle rides through quiet neighborhoods. Gas cost 36 cents a gallon, and only a few families had vehicles in those days, so bicycles were common transportation. The pace of life was slower, more trusting. Neighbors knew each other's names, doors stayed unlocked, and a young woman could ride her bike alone without fear. This peaceful world was about to be shattered by an event that would haunt Rochester for decades. But first, let me tell you about Angela. Angela Marie Thompson was 32 years old in the summer of 1972, though she looked younger with her bright smile and optimistic spirit. She had worked at St. Mary's Hospital for 8 years, specializing in pediatric care. Children adored her gentle touch and soothing voice. Fellow nurses respected her dedication. She never called in sick and often stayed late to comfort worried parents. Angela lived in a small apartment on Elm Street, just 2 miles from the hospital. Every morning she'd ride her powder blue Schwinn bicycle to work, her white nurse's cap secured with bobby pins, a wicker basket attached to the handlebars for her lunch and personal items. She was saving money to buy a small house, dreaming of a garden where she could grow flowers. Angela had never married, but she wasn't lonely. She considered her patients and co-workers her extended family. Nobody could have predicted what was coming. Margaret Thompson, Angela's younger sister by 3 years, lived just across town with her husband and 2 small children. The sisters talked every Tuesday evening without fail, sharing stories about work, family, and dreams. Margaret often joked that Angela was the good one, always helping others, never complaining, radiating kindness wherever she went. Their childhood had been difficult after their parents divorced when they were teenagers, but the sisters had supported each other through everything. Margaret kept a spare key to Angela's apartment and watered her plants when she worked double shifts. Angela, in return, babysat Margaret's children and brought them small gifts from the hospital gift shop. They had a tradition of meeting for coffee every Sunday after church, discussing everything from recipes to romance novels. Margaret treasured these moments, never imagining how precious these memories would become. Their bond was about to be tested in ways neither sister could have imagined. Monday, June 12th, 1972. Started like any other day at St. Mary's Hospital. Angela arrived at 6:30 a.m. for the morning shift. Her bicycle parked in the designated area behind the employee entrance. She worked in the children's ward, checking on young patients, administering medications, and comforting worried families. Nurse Patricia Collins, who worked the adjacent ward, remembered seeing Angela around 2:01 p.m., discussing a difficult case involving a 6-year-old boy with pneumonia. Angela seemed her usual caring self, perhaps a bit tired from the busy morning. Dr. Harrison, the attending physician, recalled Angela staying an extra 20 minutes to comfort the boy's mother, promising to check on him during the evening shift change. Angela clocked out at 3:15 p.m., 15 minutes late due to her extended care. Security guard Robert Mills watched her retrieve her bicycle, noticing she seemed thoughtful but not distressed. She waved goodbye, adjusted her white cap, and pedaled toward the street. It was the last time anyone at the hospital would see her alive. Angela's route home was predictable and safe, or so everyone thought. She would exit the hospital parking lot, turn left on Main Street, then right on Oak Avenue, following it for about a mile before turning onto the quieter residential streets leading to her apartment. The entire journey typically took 12 minutes by bicycle. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchkins, who lived on Oak Avenue, was watering her garden around 3:30 p.m. when she saw Angela pedal past, waving as she always did. Angela appeared normal, even cheerful, her nurse's cap perfectly in place despite the warm afternoon breeze. She was following her usual route. Nothing seemed amiss. But somewhere between Oak Avenue and Elm Street, Angela vanished. Her bicycle, her cap, her small purse with a hospital ID badge, everything disappeared, as if she had simply evaporated into the summer air. The distance between Mrs. Hutchkins's house and Angela's apartment was less than half a mile. What happened in those crucial minutes remains a mystery. By 6:00 p.m., Margaret began to worry. Angela always called after her shift to check on the children and share stories from her day. When the phone remained silent, Margaret tried calling Angela's apartment. No answer. At 7:30 p.m., Margaret drove to Angela's building and knocked on her door. Silence. Using her spare key, she entered the tidy apartment. Angela's bed was made, her morning coffee cup washed and put away, but there was no sign she had returned home. Her work uniform for Tuesday's shift hung neatly in the closet, her alarm clock set for 5:30 a.m. Margaret checked with the landlord, Mr. Peterson, who hadn't seen Angela return. She called St. Mary's Hospital. Angela had left on schedule and mentioned no plans to go anywhere except home. As darkness fell, Margaret's concern transformed into genuine fear. Angela was responsible, predictable, and devoted to her routine. She would never simply disappear without explanation. Something was terribly wrong. At 8:45 p.m., Margaret called the Rochester Police Department. Desk Sergeant Williams listened to her concerns with apparent disinterest. Adult women, he explained, had the right to disappear if they chose. Maybe Angela had met someone, decided to take a spontaneous trip, or simply needed time alone. Margaret insisted this was completely out of character. Angela was responsible, caring, and would never worry her family deliberately. The sergeant suggested waiting 24 hours before filing a missing person report. Young women sometimes need space, he said dismissively. Margaret felt her frustration building. She knew her sister better than anyone. Angela didn't take spontaneous trips, didn't have secret boyfriends, and certainly wouldn't abandon her patients without notice. She demanded to speak with a detective, but was told none were available for non-emergency situations. As Margaret left the police station, she felt utterly alone. If the police wouldn't help immediately, she would have to start searching herself. Time was slipping away, and every minute mattered. By Tuesday morning, when Angela failed to appear for her hospital shift, Margaret knew her worst fears were justified. She called in sick to her own job and began organizing a search. Her husband, Tom, initially shared the police's skepticism, but agreed to help after seeing Margaret's determination. They started by retracing Angela's route from the hospital, questioning neighbors and shop owners along the way. Mrs. Hutchins confirmed seeing Angela around 3:30 p.m., waving as usual. After that, the trail went cold. Margaret posted handwritten flyers throughout the neighborhood. Missing Angela Thompson, 32, nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. Last seen Monday, June 12th, riding a blue Schwinn bicycle. She included Angela's photo, a professional headshot showing her warm smile and kind eyes. Local businesses agreed to display the flyers, and some neighbors joined the search. They checked parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. Margaret felt a growing sense of dread. Angela would never voluntarily cause this much worry and disruption. Something horrible had happened to her beloved sister. After 48 hours, the Rochester Police Department officially opened a missing person case. Detective Frank Morrison, a 15-year veteran, was assigned to lead the investigation. He was thorough but skeptical, still believing Angela had likely left voluntarily. Morrison interviewed Angela's co-workers, friends, and neighbors, searching for clues about her state of mind or any unusual behavior. Everyone described Angela as happy, stable, and dedicated to her work. There were no signs of depression, financial problems, or romantic troubles. Morrison expanded the search to include nearby towns. Thinking Angela might have been visiting someone, he checked bus stations, train terminals, and car rental agencies. No one matching Angela's description had been seen. The detective also investigated the possibility of foul play, but there were no obvious suspects or motives. Angela had no enemies, no dangerous relationships, no involvement with drugs or crime. As days passed without leads, Morrison began to suspect they might never find answers. The case was becoming more mysterious and disturbing with each passing hour. News of Angela's disappearance spread throughout Rochester's tight-knit community. St. Mary's Hospital organized volunteer search parties with dozens of staff members spending their off hours combing through parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. Local businesses donated food and supplies for the searchers. The Rochester Democrat and Chronicle ran Angela's story on the front page, generating tips and volunteer support. High school students joined weekend searches, methodically walking through every accessible area within a 10-mile radius of Angela's last known location. Margaret coordinated these efforts from her kitchen table, marking searched areas on a large map and logging every tip, no matter how unlikely. The community response was overwhelming, proof of how much Angela meant to everyone who knew her. Church groups held prayer vigils, and neighbors organized fundraising efforts to support the search. Yet, despite hundreds of hours of searching and genuine community concern, no trace of Angela emerged. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and growing despair. Over the following weeks, the police received dozens of tips and reported sightings. A bus driver claimed to have seen Angela boarding a Greyhound to Buffalo. A store clerk in nearby Henrietta insisted she had served Angela ice cream 3 days after the disappearance. Each lead required investigation, sending Margaret's hopes soaring only to crash when the sightings proved false or inconclusive. Detective Morrison followed every credible tip, but they all led nowhere. The most promising lead came from a fisherman who found women's clothing near the Genesee River. But the items didn't belong to Angela. A psychic from Albany contacted the police, claiming to have visions of Angela in a basement somewhere in the city. Despite Morrison's skepticism, desperate family members convinced him to investigate several basement locations. Nothing was found. After 6 weeks of intensive searching, the active investigation began to wind down. Morrison assured Margaret that the case would remain open, but resources had to be redirected to newer cases. The trail was getting colder by the day. As weeks turned to months without answers, rumors began spreading throughout Rochester. Some neighbors whispered that Angela had been having a secret affair and had run away with a married man. Others suggested she had suffered a mental breakdown and was living homeless in another city. More sinister theories emerged. Perhaps she had been kidnapped by human traffickers or murdered by a serial killer passing through town. Margaret found these rumors deeply painful, especially the suggestions that Angela had chosen to disappear. She knew her sister's character. Angela was incapable of deliberately causing such pain to her family. The rumors reflected people's need to make sense of the inexplicable, but they also revealed uncomfortable truths about how quickly a missing person's reputation could be destroyed by speculation. Margaret began avoiding certain neighbors and social gatherings where she might hear hurtful gossip about Angela. The truth was bad enough without adding layers of unfounded accusations. She preferred focusing her energy on continued searching rather than defending her sister's memory against baseless rumors. As Detective Morrison interviewed more potential witnesses, conflicting accounts emerged that complicated the investigation. Harold Jenkins, a construction worker, claimed he saw Angela talking to a man in a dark sedan near the corner of Oak and Pine around 4:00 p.m. on June 12th. However, teenager Billy Crawford insisted he saw Angela riding her bicycle toward Maple Street around the same time, a completely different direction. Mrs. Dorothy Walsh was certain she spotted Angela entering Riverside Park, but park maintenance worker Jose Martinez had been working there all afternoon and saw no one matching her description. These contradictory sightings frustrated Morrison and gave false hope to Margaret. Each witness seemed genuinely convinced of what they had seen, but their stories couldn't all be true. Morrison began to suspect that people were unconsciously filling in gaps in their memory, or perhaps confusing Angela with other women. The human mind, he realized, was an unreliable recorder of events. These conflicting accounts made it impossible to establish Angela's actual whereabouts after leaving Mrs. Hutchins's sight on Oak Avenue. By autumn 1972, Detective Morrison had exhausted most conventional investigative approaches. Angela's bank account remained untouched, suggesting she hadn't withdrawn money for a planned departure. Her apartment showed no signs of hasty packing or struggle. Medical records revealed no history of mental illness or suicidal thoughts. Morrison expanded the investigation to include surrounding states, coordinating with police departments in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Vermont. Missing person bulletins were distributed nationwide, but generated no credible leads. The detective even consulted with FBI agents specializing in missing persons cases, but they found no evidence linking Angela's disappearance to known criminal patterns. Morrison's superiors began pressuring him to focus on newer cases with better prospects for resolution. The Angela Thompson file was gradually relegated to his desk drawer, pulled out occasionally when new tips arrived, but otherwise gathering dust. Margaret felt increasingly frustrated with the police response. sensing that they had given up hope. She refused to accept that her sister had simply vanished without explanation, but wasn't sure what else could be done. Frustrated by the stalled police investigation, Margaret decided to hire a private investigator using money from Angela's savings account. Robert Chen, a former police detective who specialized in missing persons cases, agreed to review the evidence and conduct fresh interviews. Chen was thorough and professional, but after 3 weeks of investigation, he reached the same dead end as the police. He suspected foul play, but couldn't identify any suspects or locate physical evidence. Desperate for answers, Margaret also consulted with several psychics recommended by other families of missing persons. Most offered vague, generic insights, but one woman named Madame Rosa claimed to sense that Angela was trapped in darkness somewhere near water. This led to additional searches along the Genesee River and its tributaries, but nothing was found. Margaret spent hundreds of dollars on these alternative approaches, money the family could barely afford, but felt she had to explore every possibility. The private investigator and psychics provided emotional support, but no concrete answers about Angela's fate. The ongoing mystery of Angela's disappearance began taking a severe toll on Margaret's family. Her husband, Tom, initially supportive, grew frustrated with Margaret's obsessive focus on the search. Their young children, ages 6 and 4, couldn't understand why Mommy was always sad and distracted. Margaret had difficulty sleeping, often lying awake, imagining terrible scenarios about Angela's fate. She lost weight and developed chronic headaches from stress. Tom suggested she seek counseling, but Margaret insisted she couldn't rest until Angela was found. Their marriage became strained as Margaret spent increasing amounts of time and money on the search efforts. Extended family members, initially sympathetic, began suggesting that Margaret needed to move on and accept reality. These well-meaning comments hurt deeply. How could she abandon her sister? Margaret felt increasingly isolated, as if she were the only person who still believed Angela deserved to be found. The grief was transforming her from a happy wife and mother into someone consumed by loss and determination. The family was fracturing under the weight of unanswered questions. Despite the emotional toll, Margaret refused to let Angela's memory fade. She kept Angela's apartment exactly as it was, paying the rent each month and visiting weekly to water the plants and dust the furniture. Angela's nursing uniforms remained hanging in the closet, her favorite books still stacked on the nightstand. Margaret created a scrapbook documenting the search efforts, newspaper clippings, and memories shared by Angela's friends and co-workers. She organized annual memorial services at St. Mary's Hospital, where Angela's colleagues shared stories about her kindness and dedication. Margaret also established a small scholarship fund for nursing students, ensuring Angela's commitment to caring for others would continue helping people. These activities provided some comfort, but couldn't fill the massive hole left by Angela's absence. Margaret wrote letters to Angela, storing them in a special box, explaining what was happening in the family, and expressing her ongoing love and determination to find answers. These rituals helped Margaret cope with the uncertainty, while maintaining hope that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge about what happened to her beloved sister. As 1972 became 1973, then 1974, Angela's case gradually faded from public attention. Detective Morrison retired in 1976, passing the file to younger officers who viewed it as a cold case with little chance of resolution. Margaret continued her solitary search, but with less community support and dwindling resources. Her marriage survived, though changed by the ordeal. Her children grew up knowing they had an aunt who had mysteriously disappeared, understanding why their mother sometimes seemed sad for no apparent reason. Margaret aged visibly during these years, her face marked by chronic worry and sleepless nights. She developed a routine of driving Angela's old route every month, hoping to notice something previously overlooked. The neighborhood changed around her. New families moved in, old witnesses moved away or died, and physical landmarks were altered by development. By 1980, Margaret was often the only person who remembered the details of Angela's disappearance. The case file gathered dust in police storage, officially open but practically forgotten. Margaret felt like a guardian of her sister's memory, alone in her determination to find answers. In early 2002, 30 years after Angela's disappearance, Margaret found herself returning to Rochester following a difficult divorce. Her children were grown with families of their own, and she needed a fresh start, somewhere familiar yet different. She rented a small house on the east side of town, not far from where Angela had lived decades earlier. The city had changed dramatically. New shopping centers, subdivisions, and business districts had transformed the landscape. St. Mary's Hospital had expanded into a modern medical complex, barely recognizable from the 1970s. Margaret was 59 years old, graying and worn by 3 decades of unanswered questions. But her determination to find Angela had never wavered. She decided to revisit all the old locations, hoping that time might have revealed clues previously hidden. The police file remained officially open, though the current detective assigned to cold cases admitted he had never actively investigated Angela's disappearance. Margaret realized that if answers were going to be found, she would have to find them herself. This return to Rochester marked the beginning of a new chapter in her long search. On a crisp October morning in 2002, Margaret decided to walk Angela's route from the hospital to her old apartment. The streets were familiar, yet foreign. Many buildings had been demolished or renovated, and the quiet residential character had given way to busier commercial development. She started at what had been St. Mary's Hospital, now part of a larger medical complex, and followed the route Angela would have taken on her bicycle. Oak Avenue was wider now, with more traffic and fewer trees. Mrs. Hutchins's house had been torn down for a convenience store. As Margaret walked, she tried to imagine what Angela might have seen or experienced in those final moments. The journey took her through areas that had once been searched thoroughly, but had since changed beyond recognition. Near what had been Angela's apartment building, Margaret noticed a wooded area she didn't remember from the 1970s. Urban development had shifted over the decades, creating new green spaces while eliminating others. Something about this particular area felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. It deserved closer investigation. The wooded area that caught Margaret's attention was part of a new city park created in the 1990s, when several old industrial buildings were demolished. A network of walking trails had been carved through the trees, popular with joggers and dog walkers. Margaret decided to explore these paths, thinking they might have existed in some form during the 1970s. The main trail was well maintained and clearly modern, but she noticed a narrower, overgrown path branching off toward a more secluded area. This secondary trail seemed older, perhaps predating the official park development. As she followed it deeper into the woods, Margaret felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. The path wound through dense vegetation before opening into a small clearing dominated by several large oak trees. The area felt isolated and forgotten despite being within walking distance of busy streets. Margaret had the unsettling sensation that she was close to something important, a feeling that had eluded her for 30 years. Her heart began beating faster as she continued exploring this forgotten corner of Rochester. As Margaret rounded a bend in the overgrown trail, she stopped abruptly. There, partially hidden by decades of accumulated vines and fallen leaves, was a bicycle. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved closer. The frame was powder blue, though faded and rusted after 30 years of exposure to the elements. Vines had grown through the spokes, and moss covered much of the metal, but the basic structure remained intact. Margaret's hands trembled as she began clearing away the vegetation. The bicycle had a small wicker basket attached to the handlebars, now rotted and broken. As she cleaned away more debris, her heart began pounding. This bicycle looked exactly like Angela's. The same model, the same color, the same style of basket. Margaret knew she needed to be certain before calling the police. She searched for identifying marks, her fingers tracing the rusted frame with desperate hope. If this was Angela's bicycle, it would be the first concrete evidence found in 3 decades. The discovery would change everything, potentially providing answers that had remained hidden for 30 years. With shaking hands, Margaret continued examining the bicycle, looking for any identifying features that could confirm her suspicions. She remembered that Angela had registered her bike with the hospital security office, and there should be a serial number stamped somewhere on the frame. Margaret cleared away more rust and grime, searching methodically despite her excitement and fear. Finally, near the bottom bracket where the pedals attached, she found what she was looking for, a series of numbers and letters stamped into the metal. Though partially corroded, the serial number was still readable. SN4472196699. Margaret pulled out a small notebook where she had recorded every detail about Angela's disappearance over the years. Her heart stopped as she found the matching entry. Angela's bicycle serial number, carefully copied from hospital security records in 1972. The numbers matched perfectly. This was definitely Angela's bicycle. After 30 years of searching, Margaret had found the first piece of concrete evidence. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had the bicycle ended up in this secluded location? Where was Angela? What had happened here 30 years ago? Margaret immediately called the Rochester Police Department, her voice shaking as she explained her discovery to the desk sergeant. Within an hour, Detective Lisa Rodriguez arrived at the scene with a crime scene photographer and evidence technician. Rodriguez was young, professional, and took Margaret's discovery seriously. She carefully documented the bicycle's location and condition, taking dozens of photographs from every angle. The serial number was photographed and verified against the original missing person report. Rodriguez explained that the bicycle would be transported to the police lab for thorough analysis. Though after 30 years of exposure, finding usable evidence would be challenging. Margaret watched as officers carefully removed the bicycle from its resting place, noting how the vegetation had grown around and through it, suggesting it had been there for decades. Rodriguez promised to review the original case file and interview Margaret about any new information she might have remembered over the years. The discovery breathed new life into Angela's case, transforming it from a cold case into an active investigation. Finally, after 3 decades, there was hope for answers. The police forensics team spent several days thoroughly examining the location where Angela's bicycle was found. The secluded clearing showed signs of long-term human activity, though determining when that activity occurred was challenging after 30 years. Investigators found several rusted metal objects buried in the soil, tools, pieces of machinery, and what appeared to be personal items. The vegetation patterns suggested the area had been disturbed decades earlier, consistent with the timeline of Angela's disappearance. Soil samples were collected for analysis, and metal detectors were used to search for additional evidence. Detective Rodriguez discovered that the trail Margaret had followed was indeed older than the official park, possibly dating back to the 1960s or earlier. City records showed the area had once been part of a larger industrial complex that included storage buildings and maintenance facilities. Most interestingly, the land had been privately owned in 1972 before being sold to the city in the 1980s. The previous owner was an elderly man named Walter Brennan, who had died in 1995. The investigation was beginning to reveal secrets that had been buried for decades. Detective Rodriguez's investigation into Walter Brennan revealed a troubling history. Brennan had owned the property from 1968 until 1984, living in a small house on the eastern edge of the land. He had worked as a maintenance supervisor at several local institutions, including a state mental health facility that closed in 1969. Neighbors from the 1970s, now elderly themselves, remembered Brennan as a reclusive man who discouraged visitors and posted no trespassing signs throughout his property. County records showed that police had questioned Brennan briefly during the original investigation into Angela's disappearance, but he had provided an alibi and was never considered a serious suspect. More disturbing was Rodriguez's discovery that Brennan had been questioned in connection with 2 other missing person cases in the 1960s, both involving young women who had vanished without a trace. In each case, insufficient evidence prevented charges from being filed. Brennan's former neighbors described him as odd and creepy, mentioning that he often worked at night and seemed to have an unusual interest in young women who passed by his property. The pattern was becoming increasingly suspicious. Rodriguez's investigation revealed that Walter Brennan had worked at Riverside State Hospital from 1965 to 1969, when the facility was closed due to budget cuts and changing attitudes toward mental health treatment. The hospital had housed patients with various conditions, including those committed involuntarily by families or courts. Employment records showed that Brennan had been fired from his maintenance position in early 1969 following complaints about his behavior toward female staff members and patients. Several former employees, now in their 70s and 80s, remembered Brennan as inappropriate and threatening. One retired nurse recalled reporting Brennan for entering patient rooms without authorization and making uncomfortable comments to young women. The hospital's closure had scattered records and personnel, making it difficult to fully investigate Brennan's history there. However, Rodriguez discovered that at least 3 female patients had disappeared from the facility during Brennan's employment, all officially listed as voluntary departures despite their severe mental conditions. The coincidences were mounting, suggesting a pattern of predatory behavior that may have continued after Brennan's dismissal. Angela's case was looking less like a random crime and more like part of a larger, more sinister pattern. As Detective Rodriguez delved deeper into Walter Brennan's history and the connection to Angela's disappearance, she encountered unexpected resistance from within the police department and city government. Her requests for additional resources were denied, and she was told to focus on more current cases with better prospects for resolution. When Rodriguez tried to access archived records from Riverside State Hospital, she was informed that many files had been lost or destroyed during the facility's closure. City officials seemed reluctant to pursue an investigation that might reveal decades-old institutional failures and cover-ups. Rodriguez found herself working alone, using her own time to follow leads that her superiors deemed unimportant. Margaret noticed the detectives' frustration during their meetings, sensing that political considerations were interfering with the search for truth. Anonymous phone calls warned Rodriguez to leave sleeping dogs lie and focus on other cases. The resistance only strengthened Rodriguez's determination to uncover the truth. But she realized she was fighting not just an old crime, but an entire system designed to protect institutional reputations rather than serve justice for victims like Angela. Frustrated by the official investigation's limitations, Margaret decided to conduct her own research into Walter Brennan and the mysterious property where Angela's bicycle was found. She spent hours at the Rochester Public Library, searching through old newspaper archives and city records. Margaret discovered that Brennan had owned several properties throughout the region during the 1960s and 1970s, often purchasing them through shell companies or business partnerships that obscured his involvement. She also found references to other missing persons cases in nearby towns, including a 19-year-old college student who disappeared in 1974 and a 25-year-old secretary who vanished in 1976. Both cases remained unsolved, and both women had last been seen in areas where Brennan had owned property. Margaret began mapping these locations, finding disturbing patterns that suggested a serial predator had operated in the region for years. Her amateur investigation was yielding more concrete leads than the official police work, but she was also uncovering dangers she hadn't anticipated. Someone was watching her research, and she began receiving threatening phone calls, warning her to stop digging into the past. Margaret's research led her back to the wooded area where Angela's bicycle had been found. Using old property maps from the library, she realized that Walter Brennan's original property had extended further than current park boundaries suggested. Following an almost invisible trail deeper into the woods, Margaret discovered the foundation of a small building that had been demolished years earlier. Local records indicated it had been a maintenance shed used by Brennan for storing equipment and supplies. The concrete foundation was cracked and overgrown, but Margaret could still make out the basic structure. Metal scraps and rusted tools were scattered around the area, along with pieces of rotted wood that had once formed the walls. Most significantly, Margaret found several personal items partially buried near the foundation: a woman's shoe, pieces of jewelry, and scraps of fabric that appeared to be from clothing. The items were old and weather-damaged, but they suggested that this location had been significant in ways that investigators had never discovered. Margaret carefully documented everything with her camera, knowing that these findings could be crucial evidence in understanding what had happened to Angela and possibly other victims. While exploring the area around the demolished shed's foundation, Margaret noticed that the soil in one corner appeared to have been disturbed at some point, though vegetation had since grown over it. Using a small gardening trowel she had brought, Margaret carefully began digging in this spot. About 2 feet down, her tool struck something hard, a metal container of some kind. After careful excavation, she uncovered a rusted metal box approximately the size of a shoebox with a simple latch closure. Margaret's heart pounded as she carefully lifted the box from its hiding place. Despite years underground, the container had protected its contents from complete decay. Inside, wrapped in deteriorated plastic, Margaret found items that made her blood run cold. Several driver's licenses belonging to different women, all young, all from the 1960s and 1970s. There were also photographs, surveillance-style pictures, that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge. Among them was a photograph of Angela taken outside St. Mary's Hospital, showing her getting onto her bicycle. Margaret realized she had uncovered evidence of a serial predator who had operated in Rochester for decades. The photographs Margaret found in the buried box were disturbing evidence of systematic stalking. Each picture showed young women in various everyday situations, walking to work, shopping, riding bicycles, or sitting in parks. The photos appeared to have been taken from concealment, suggesting the subjects were unaware they were being watched. Margaret recognized several locations around Rochester, including streets near St. Mary's Hospital and other areas where missing person cases had been reported over the years. The quality and style of the photographs suggested they had been taken by someone with photographic experience, possibly using professional equipment. Some photos had dates written on the back in neat handwriting spanning from 1967 to 1976. Angela's photograph was dated June 10, 1972, just 2 days before her disappearance. Margaret realized she was looking at a predator's trophy collection, documenting his victims before he struck. The systematic nature of the photography suggested careful planning and long-term surveillance. This wasn't random crime. It was methodical hunting. As Margaret examined the contents of the buried box more carefully, a chilling pattern emerged. The driver's licenses belonged to 7 different women, ages ranging from 19 to 35, all from the Rochester area and surrounding counties. Margaret cross-referenced the names with missing person reports she had researched over the years, finding matches for 5 of the 7 women. All had disappeared between 1967 and 1976, during the years when Walter Brennan owned the property. The licenses had been carefully preserved, suggesting they were kept as souvenirs or trophies. Also in the box were small personal items: a pair of earrings, a hospital name badge, a school ring, and a small locket with a young woman's photo inside. These items appeared to be keepsakes taken from victims, further evidence of a serial predator's systematic approach. Margaret realized that Angela's case was part of a much larger pattern of disappearances that had been overlooked or inadequately investigated for decades. The scope of the crimes was staggering, and she wondered how many other victims there might have been whose evidence had never been discovered. Margaret immediately contacted Detective Rodriguez with news of her discovery, but the response was disappointing. Rodriguez seemed overwhelmed by the implications of the evidence and concerned about the jurisdictional complications involved. Several of the driver's licenses belonged to women from other counties, requiring coordination between multiple police departments. More troubling was Rodriguez's suggestion that Margaret shouldn't have been conducting her own investigation on what was now considered an active crime scene. Margaret felt frustrated by the bureaucratic response to evidence that clearly demonstrated a pattern of serial crimes. She decided to contact local news media, hoping that public pressure might force authorities to take the case more seriously. Channel 8. News agreed to interview Margaret about her discoveries, though they were cautious about making accusations against a deceased man who couldn't defend himself. Margaret understood their concerns, but felt that the victims deserved to have their stories told. She was determined to ensure that Angela and the other women wouldn't be forgotten, even if it meant challenging the system that had failed them for so many years. The truth was finally emerging, but the fight for justice was just beginning. Margaret's interview with Channel 8 News aired on November 15, 2002, generating immediate public interest and controversy. The story, titled "Cold Case Breakthrough: Missing Nurse's Sister," uncovers evidence of serial crimes, featured Margaret holding Angela's hospital photo while describing the discovery of the bicycle and the buried box of evidence. The broadcast included interviews with former neighbors who remembered Walter Brennan and experts who discussed the significance of the physical evidence. Within hours of the broadcast, the police department received dozens of calls from viewers who remembered other missing person cases or had information about Brennan. Several elderly residents came forward with stories about Brennan's suspicious behavior, including reports of him following young women and being found on private property without permission. The media attention also brought criticism from some officials who accused Margaret of sensationalizing an unproven theory and potentially damaging the reputation of a deceased man. However, the public response was overwhelmingly supportive of Margaret's efforts to find answers about her sister's disappearance. The story was picked up by regional news outlets, bringing additional attention to the case and pressure on authorities to thoroughly investigate the evidence. As media attention intensified, Margaret began encountering more aggressive resistance from various institutions. City officials expressed concern about potential lawsuits from families of other victims and worried about Rochester's reputation as a safe community. The police department faced criticism for their handling of the original investigation and their initial dismissal of Margaret's recent discoveries. Hospital administrators were concerned about liability issues related to Angela's employment and the security of their staff. Most disturbing was Margaret's discovery that several key pieces of evidence from the original 1972 investigation had mysteriously disappeared from police storage. Files that should have contained witness statements and physical evidence were either missing or heavily redacted. Margaret suspected that certain individuals had worked to suppress information about Brennan's crimes to protect institutional reputations and avoid scandal. The resistance confirmed her belief that Angela's disappearance had been part of a larger pattern of institutional failure and cover-up. Margaret realized she was fighting not just for justice for Angela, but against a system that prioritized protecting powerful institutions over finding truth for victims and their families. Through her investigation and the evidence she had uncovered, Margaret was able to piece together a likely scenario of what had happened to Angela on June 12, 1972. Walter Brennan had been stalking Angela for several days, photographing her routine and planning his attack. On that Monday afternoon, he had waited along her route home from the hospital, possibly using his vehicle to force her off the road or lure her into stopping. Angela had been taken to Brennan's property, where the maintenance shed served as a location for his crimes. The bicycle had been hidden in the woods to eliminate evidence, while Angela herself had likely been killed and buried somewhere on the extensive property. Over the years, development and land sales had disturbed or destroyed other evidence. But the bicycle and buried box had remained hidden until Margaret's determined search uncovered them. The discovery suggested that Angela had been one of multiple victims of a serial predator who had operated in the Rochester area for nearly a decade. While the full truth would never be known, Margaret finally had answers about what had happened to her beloved sister. The knowledge was painful, but provided the closure she had sought for 30 years. Despite the compelling evidence Margaret had uncovered, justice for Angela and the other victims remained elusive. Walter Brennan had died in 1995, taking his secrets to the grave and beyond the reach of criminal prosecution. The statute of limitations had expired on many related crimes, and much of the physical evidence had been compromised by decades of exposure and contamination. Several other suspects who might have been accomplices or had knowledge of Brennan's crimes were also deceased or too elderly to face trial. The police investigation, while reopened, proceeded slowly due to the age of the case and limited resources. Margaret found herself in the frustrating position of having solved the mystery of Angela's disappearance while being unable to achieve full legal justice. However, she took some comfort in knowing that the truth had finally been revealed and that other families might find closure through her discoveries. The case demonstrated how institutional failures and delayed justice could allow predators to operate with impunity while victims' families suffered in ignorance. Margaret's determination had succeeded where the official system had failed, but the cost had been enormous for everyone involved. Margaret kept Angela's hospital photograph in a silver frame on her mantelpiece, finally able to look at her sister's image without the crushing weight of unanswered questions. The truth about Angela's fate was horrific, but knowing was better than 30 years of wondering and hoping. Margaret had succeeded in her mission to find answers, but the journey had revealed disturbing truths about institutional failures, cover-ups, and the vulnerability of young women in seemingly safe communities. She established a foundation to support families of missing persons and to advocate for better police procedures in cold case investigations. Margaret also worked with legislators to extend statutes of limitations for serious crimes and to improve record-keeping procedures that might prevent evidence from disappearing. As she reflected on her 3-decade search, Margaret realized that what she had found wasn't just a bicycle in the woods. It was a doorway to something much darker that had been hidden in plain sight. The discovery had revealed not just Angela's fate, but the systematic failure of institutions to protect vulnerable people and pursue justice for victims. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again, and the truth would continue to haunt Rochester long after Margaret was gone. Angela's story reminds us that some missing person cases never truly close, even when answers are found decades later. This cold case investigation reveals how one sister's determination uncovered a chilling mystery that had remained unsolved for 30 years. The nurse who vanished without a trace in 1972 became part of a larger pattern of mysterious disappearances that shocked an entire community. If you're fascinated by true crime stories and unsolved mysteries like this missing persons investigation, subscribe for more suspenseful disappearance stories. Share your thoughts about this vanished nurse case in the comments below. What other cold case files would you like us to explore? Remember, behind every missing person documentary is a family still searching for answers. and sometimes the truth is more disturbing than we ever imagined.